My religious mother told me a story about angels. I've always been very fascinated with stories of things I cannot explain or see. Angels, demons, ghosts, etc. My mother has always been extremely religious, shunning any movie, story, or idea that involves anything that doesn't serve the Lord or the church. She always has the typical Bible stories to tell, and some others just always about God and His wonderful work. The other day I was visiting my mom with my daughters and eating lunch, telling her about how on the way over to her house there was a crazy driver who almost ran me off the road. With my children in the car, no less, I was very upset. Mom then goes off on a tangent about how I have great guardian angels and they've always been looking out for me. I just kind of smile and look down. Then my mother says, "Seriously, ever since you were 4 weeks old, I've seen them with you." Excuse me, creepy much? Staring at my mom all confused, I asked her what she's talking about. She proceeds to tell me a story that made me sick to my stomach. When you were little, Rena, just 4 weeks old, your father and I were in a very rough position. We had no money, no food, ended up sleeping on a mattress in your grandfather's garage. The head of our bed would be against the far wall, and our feet would be on the end of the garage where the garage door was. So sleeping, we would be facing the garage door. On this particular night, your father and I were having harsh discussions about how difficult it was to provide for you. After everyone fell asleep, I stayed up late that night, praying you'll be taken care of, happy and healthy, praying your guardian angels could watch over you and protect you where your father and I couldn't. I laid down. The clock said 11:05 p.m. I stared at the ceiling. As each minute passed, I grew anxious, started to feel this overwhelming feeling that you would not, in fact, be safe. I started to panic, felt sick, like if I fell asleep, something terrible would happen to you. Sweating, I look at you, in between your father and I. I pray one last time. Eventually, I begin to feel sleepy, but I begin to hear a buzzing noise, and the ground slowly begins to shake. When I turn to look at you and your dad, you're both sound asleep. Under the cracks of the garage, a faint light begins to show up. To the right of the garage door, there was another door, a typical doorway that you use to go outside, and it began to have a white light shining between the cracks as well, getting brighter and brighter, both doors beginning to shake harder and harder, getting brighter. Absolutely terrified, the garage door opens so slowly, and as the garage door goes up and that bright white light blinds me, I begin to see the blurry, faint silhouettes of 3 beings. They look taller than average and skinnier. They come into the room, and the middle guy with his long arms reaches between your father and I, grabs your tiny little leg, and begins to pull you away. This whole time I felt frozen, but once they grabbed you, I jolted up and grabbed your arms. There was a bit of a struggle, and I felt so much tension in your body, I didn't want to tear you in half, so I let go. The moment I do, I feel like I wake up, gasping, sweating, and crying. I sit up and look around, and you're not between your sleeping dad and I. You're at the foot of the bed, sound asleep. I grab you and hold you, happy you're okay, but I look over at the clock, and it says 11:06 p.m. What the hell, Mom? That sounds terrifying. My kids ran into the house from playing outside. My mom, then in such a chipper way, says, "Those guardian angels would never let anything happen to you. You got lucky." Now, the past few days, it's been hard to sleep. When I was little, my father worked as a professional clown, as Mr. Derpy, under which name he achieved great success. I, of course, knew of Mr. Derpy from a young age. However, as a result of the heavy makeup he wore as Derpy, I never recognized him as being the same person as my father, conceiving him as being just another member of our family. This duality of their nature being accentuated by my father's radically altered personality, whilst in costume as Mr. Derpy, and never even considering me seeing the pair simultaneously. My mother never correcting this misconception, presumably as she thought it self-evident, assuming some innate understanding of the world I simply did not possess. Despite my conception of Derpy as being a member of my family, this in no way translated to any feelings of affection towards him, Indeed, quite the opposite was the case. I hated and feared Derpy as a constant intrusion upon the happy and well-established order within the household. I now wonder how my mother managed not to notice my extreme aversion to the man amidst showing me endless photos and videos from his performances, as well as the occasional articles on the news including him. My father was constantly trying to frighten me for his own amusement, and so of course when he learned about my misconceptions surrounding Mr. Derpy, he immediately availed himself of it, often threatening me with punishment from Mr. Derpy should I misbehave or disobey him in any particular way, as well as purposefully frightening me whilst in costume, especially when my mother was absent, which caused me to become even more a shy and acquiescent young boy than I had been previously, and also resulting in a series of regular nightmares surrounding Mr. Derpy. Even once my mother finally figured it out and tried to convince me that Mr. Derpy and my father were one and the same. I couldn't get my conviction of them being two distinct personalities out of my head. My new understanding of the situation being that Mr. Derpy took possession of my father's body at certain intervals, something my father of course encouraged once learning of it. And once my parents had divorced for unrelated reasons, my father continued to use Mr. Derpy as a looming threat in case of disruliness, with the alteration being him allowing Mr. Derpy to possess his body in order to keep me in line in that case during my weekend excursions with the man, which I would rather have dispensed with. Although, of course, fear of Mr. Derpy kept me from voicing this preference aloud, as despite the excursion's outward extravagance, these were no more than episodes of uninterrupted sheer terror of the possible intervention of Mr. Derpy, whilst in his custody, which threats being surely motivated more for his own entertainment than the possibility of any misbehavior on my part. My mother being too oblivious to counteract this. My father ensured this by threatening me with a visit from Mr. Derpy should I communicate to my mother on this subject, so what little further intervention she attempted was met only with unresponsiveness on my part. Once, as a result of a large fizzy drink I had consumed at my father's behest, as I felt no personal desire for such a thing, at least in my father's presence, towards the close of one of these excursions, I felt tremendous pressure upon my bladder, which I had considered of being no real account, until my father encountered an old friend of his, with whom he insisted upon conversing with for a period of time, exceeding that usually allotted for our excursion. Once the pressure became too great to ignore, I had attempted to acquaint my father with the nature of my predicament. However, he had responded negatively to this, so that after some time, I wet myself, and my humiliated father was forced to depart, which of course he was quite unhappy about, provoking the intervention of Mr. Derpy, him chasing me, screaming about the park at which our previous excursion had taken place, which scene proving to be so much a cause for alarm for some well-meaning bystanders that the police were called to the scene. My father, of course, resuming his regular personality upon their appearance and accounting for that scene by a reluctance on my account to be transported to my mother's, which he assigned to my reluctance to quit the scene of my supposed joy, which he also assigned as the cause of lateness to my mother, neither of which I protested, obviously, as result of my fear of retribution from Derpy. To this day, I still find it difficult to reconcile the leering face of Derpy with the perfectly ordinary face of my father, and I still do feel acute fear of retribution from Mr. Derpy in the case of any failure on my part. I still experience nightmares with Mr. Derpy, posing as my persecutor. I continue to receive documentation from my father of Mr. Derpy's performances on a night on regular basis. Despite me blocking any number he uses for this end, he apparently continues to use new numbers and to unaccountably discover any numbers I might adopt in order to hide from him, as evidenced by the constant barrage of videos he continues to send me. I don't know how,